Tansei, Tanishi, Buju. Welcome to Season 3 of the Traveling Métis podcast, the podcast that dives into Métis culture. Do you hear that? That is the sound of the river, which can only mean one thing. It is time to grab your paddle and your headphones and hop into your canoe, because we are heading down the river to talk to our fellow Machif storytellers. Welcome, everyone. It is Season 3. Yes, people keep giving me money to make this podcast, and I am so happy they are, because the people I was able to sit down with this season are unbelievably talented. I am privileged and honored to be on this path of sharing stories from the Métis community. I think back to the time when my grandfathers and grandmothers had to hide who they were in order to survive. You go back to the Orangemen going to Manitoba, and before that, the mode of excluding gift giving to half-breeds, where we were told we had to assimilate into First Nations communities, even though we saw ourselves as Otipomesawak, in search of freedom from the Hudson's Bay and Northwest Company. My family in particular were the Laurents, with some Beauchamp and Morin and many other sprinklings in there. My Laurent family loved to travel, hence the name of this podcast, Traveling Métis. We were all about that canoe life, traveling through the river highways all the way from the Red River through Northern Superior to the Ottawa River. I just imagine the amazing stories my grandfathers must have had combating Lake Superior and slinging furs down the St. Lawrence. The stories they brought home to their families on their travels, which inspired their sons to take on the same career they did. That's why I wanted to focus on storytelling this season and some amazing Machif storytellers. Storytelling helps us to share our history, create community, and can even help us heal. There are a lot of nuances to Métis history and culture, and it's through our stories passed down from generation to generation that we can understand ourselves and our place in community. One person who knows that being an Indigenous storyteller is not an easy task is Loretta Todd. Loretta is a Cree-Metis filmmaker from one of the OG Red River families. And I did not want to start this season without speaking to her. She is an amazing matriarch and founder of the IM4 Lab, which helps to share knowledge with Indigenous filmmakers of new technologies like AR, XR, and virtual productions. Loretta has also made a bunch of films, including Monkey Beach and the APTN series, Coyote Science. And lucky for me, Loretta is also an encyclopedia of knowledge on the history of Indigenous filmmaking in so-called Canada, because she was there. I had to turn this into a 2-part episode because there was just so much knowledge Loretta shared with me. And I think it's important as we move forward with our work as young Indigenous storytellers, we acknowledge the sacrifices those who came before us made so we don't lose all their hard work. But before Loretta takes us to school, I wanted to hear her story.
Our family is one of the original Todd families at the Red River. And then the family kind of spread out going west, eventually with my family being at the St. Paul de Métis, which was a Métis settlement, which is no longer. And my understanding is that my Métis grandfather married his Indigenous wife from Whitefish Lake First Nations. And also there is a connection with Louis Laframboise, who was from the Dakotas, from the Chippewa, and I believe Turtle Mountain, Chippewa. And yeah, that's basically my origins.
Is there anything that in particular that made you want to become a storyteller and filmmaker?
I can't honestly say that there was a time when I said, oh, yes, I'm going to be a storyteller. And I can't honestly say that there was any particular person in my life who was a real special storyteller. I always, in a strange way, felt, almost like observing. I almost felt like I was observing most of my life. And it's not because there was anything in particular, but I think it was just a sort of like lonely kid. I was a lonely kid. That's what it was. I mean, I had a big family. There was 8 of us. And then my dad's family was, even bigger. And when we were really young, we lived right next to his parents. So, my kukum and Moshima, though we didn't call them that at the time, they were Grandma and Grandpa Todd, because that's how they were known. In fact, they were known that in the Native community in Edmonton. I met Dr. Ann Anderson, many years later, and she was in my film, The Learning Path. And she said to me, "Oh, are you related to Grandma and Grandpa Todd?" And that was so interesting. And I said, "Yeah." Said, "Oh, yeah, yeah." So there was a kind of like a small Native community in Edmonton at the time. And they were Grandma and Grandpa Todd to that community. But as far as me as a storyteller, I sometimes like to tell the story about when I was very young, like before a teenager. And we had these chaotic events in our life because of just circumstances of poverty. And my father drank, unfortunately, but not always, but sometimes. And when those things would happen, we would leave. My mom would pack us up in the middle of the night and we'd leave. And we ended up in this motel on a highway outside of Edmonton. I don't even know where it was. And it was the winter, and there had been a blizzard. And my mom had gone out to look for groceries. I don't know how she did it. She didn't have a car. And my sisters and my brothers had gone out to hang out with their friends. Post blizzard, they had, I guess, taken the bus, or I don't know how they got out. But anyways, there I am alone watching my younger brother and like the other siblings in the family who were sleeping. On the TV, there was like a horror movie. I think it might have been Nosferatu, the silent Dracula movie. But in any case, it was something that was very terrifying to me as a kid. And you know how you get that sort of frozen in fear? You can't even move. I couldn't even change the channel. But there was this kind of thump outside the window. And so that kind of stirred me out of my fear. And I rushed to the window thinking, oh, maybe my mom's coming home. And I pulled back the curtain and the moon was out. And the moon was so bright. There was a few lonely trees outside the window, and the moon was casting shadows of those trees on the snow. And so it was this beautiful sort of wondrous world of black and white. And then TV was reflected in the window. And so I guess in some sort of childish mind, it made me think, well, no, it's just made up. It's just television. It's just not real. And so my fear was able to dissipate. And at the same time, I had this beautiful moment of seeing this reflection seeing this beautiful shadow at night cast from the moon and the sparkling, snow. So it was kind of like a moment of appreciation of, or almost, I wouldn't go so far as say rapture, but certainly a moment of absorption into this beautiful moment. And I guess it made me like tucked away back into my mind that this idea that it's all just light and shadow, that making film is all just light and shadow. And so when I started making films, it was like, oh yeah, it's all just light and shadow. And so I think that was perhaps a pivotal moment. Um, I mean, I don't want to go into my life's history, but I guess it's just the sense that there were circumstances. I did run away from home when I was 13, and hitchhiked across Canada and up north, and did all kinds of crazy things. And I guess at times I was in situations that were life threatening, and I think that kind of changes you. And of course, it's PTSD, but it also kind of makes you almost sense that you have not so much a higher purpose, but that you have a purpose, that you should find a purpose, that if you have survived, then you need to do something good with that. You need to, make sure that you do good things in the world, bring good to the world. And I think the other thing is, and I think that maybe this part I may go to an extreme, sometimes put yourself in service, put yourself in service to the people. And I can't say there was a revelation one day, oh yeah, put myself in service to the people. I think it was, again, just that sense of, I'm very fortunate to be here. So can I find a way to make it better for others? Of course, so all these kind of things came together around filmmaking. I don't know why filmmaking, again, to go back, I think, it was sort of when I started, despite, those, kind of humble beginnings, if you like, I eventually was fortunate enough to get work for the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. And as a summer student, I went back to school. And I don't know why, I just started sort of incorporating media into whatever I did. So if I was doing a summer student job, I was like, well, why don't I make a video about this? Or if I, how can we tell this story visually? And so those are the kinds of things that were all these little pieces that I guess were woven together to kind of draw me into this world of filmmaking. As far as, yeah, I mean, when I think back, there were, I guess maybe because the family was living in Edmonton, it was still a very racist time. And they were doing things like people would come from the res or from the settlements or just from the bush to come to visit my grandma and grandpa Todd. And I remember them sitting out in the back in the big overgrown yard and old, wooden chairs from the house, brought out to sit in a circle in the back. And I remember people talking in hushed tones and in Cree. They weren't talking English, they were speaking Cree. But then hushed tones because they didn't want the neighbors to hear because of that fear then still of the language, of speaking the language. So I guess there's a sense of this child watching this, observing this, and wanting to know what they were saying, wanting to know the stories they were telling. But because I didn't have the language, I couldn't. But I was still fascinated and absorbed just by that image alone, and just by that sort of idea that if I could be within that world, those are all these sort of, like I say, these pieces that are sort of woven together. And, I have to say that when I was a kid, I would watch old movies with my mom, and she had this particular weird kind of perception herself. So we'd watch movies, and she said, well, if I made that, she wouldn't say if I made that film, but she would more like, they should have done this. They should have done that. So, so we would have these kind of, story, discussions about how that film could have been made better.
How have you seen the industry change over the course of like when you've started to today, has it gotten easier, or are there, like, what's sort of the big differences you see? Like, are we growing as like a country and allowing like filmmakers and new voices to come up?
Well, I guess I've always been perpetually that outsider to the white industry, even outsider to the native film industries, particularly now. But in those days, there weren't that many of us, right? So um, Alan Neeson Bumsawin and Gil Gardner were the main people. Carol Geddes had made her film Dr. Lawyer, Indian Chief. But there weren't that many. There were people in the North, of course, because of Northern Native broadcast, and the Inuit broadcast, through the initiatives of people like Rosemary Guptana. There was a lot going on, but it wasn't, kind of focused. And there was a lot of newspapers, there was radio channels, there was, like I say, in the North, there was a lot going on. But for, a little runaway Native girl from prairies, you didn't perceive that. I was lucky in a way because my oldest sister, went out with somebody whose family was quite active in the Indian Association of Alberta. And so, I started to hear about politics. I started to hear about, what rights meant and what was the battle, over self-determination. I guess in those days it was more called self-determination. And so there was this whole kind of movement swirling around where people, and if you go back further, when I made the Native War veterans, there were go back further in your history. There's always real resistance. There's always been these stories, these events, these sort of political movements to change. And I think that impetus to Northern Native broadcast, Inuit broadcasting, the radio channels, the newspapers, those were all part of that political impetus for our rights, for our self-determination, for our sovereignty. So these things were all happening within that context. So it wasn't really like, oh, I'm going to be a filmmaker because, I'm going to make horror films and get rich. It was like, I'm part of this movement. I'm part of this trajectory to create awareness of our rights, to tell stories that embody people who live their rights, to kind of reclaim that emotional space of our stories, of our lives that, we were not often not, we weren't entitled to, we would just suck it up, forget it, move on kind of thing. And so here's this kind of these rich histories and these rich emotional experiences that our people were having and have had and will continue to have. And I guess that was the kind of impetus that, that led me to storytelling, to filmmaking, to the industry. I never really thought about it from the perspective of making a living and having a career. I think, again, that those times I spent at the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, I was quite young. I was a summer student. I think I was still a teenager. And I was like, got to hear the good words of George Manuel. I got to be around, uh, Philip Hall, the late Philip, all these people who are gone now, who were so certain, about our rights, about Indigenous rights. I mean, of course, I'm this little Métis Cree breed girl from Alberta, so I could never assume to have the kind of authority that the people in, like George Manuel, like Philip Paul, like Millie Knapp, all these amazing people who worked at the Union of BC Indian Chiefs at the time were elected to be part of it. Their strong advocacy for their territories, for their lands, all this stuff. It was like that's the kind of place I was in when I started making films. I saw films, and I'd heard stories, about Indigenous people fighting for their rights all around the world. And I remember there was a time when happened to be reading. I used to read a lot of magical realism from South America and Central America. There was a sort of a huge number of writers at a certain time that were writing novels, not some Indigenous, but most, maybe mixed Indigenous. And I remember reading stories about, these kind of, maybe in a village and people were asserting their rights and the soldiers or the paramilitaries would come in and shoot people. So I'm reading this stuff. And then George Manuel would come and have a lunch meeting with the staff and he would tell us, and he had encountered the very same thing when he was out organizing for the World Council of Indigenous People, going out into Indigenous communities around the world and encountering that very thing. So, you know, like that, if standing up for your rights. So for me, that was what was driving me. It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to get a career and I'm going to get famous and I'm going to do all this stuff, because I knew that wasn't going to happen. That I was so educated working there. I think it was better than anything I could have got at university. I don't want to use the word radicalized. I was so indigenized. I mean, I was so, I think you just never change. I don't admit to being decolonized. I'm sure there's many parts of me that are still very colonized, but I think that experience of seeing what decolonization looks like, what it takes to decolonize, how these people were putting their lives on the line for this, that's what came up in as far as making films. And so and particularly, I think also being this person, this outsider, I realized I couldn't be at the forefront. I had to be kind of at the background doing the work behind. And so literally being a filmmaker, you're behind the camera. So that's how I kind of, organized this in my mind, how I could serve this bigger cause and at the same time have a voice, be creative, because that's what a filmmaker is, and help further our rights and our road to full self-determination, sovereignty, and so on. So that's more how I came into it. But I did go to film school and I did come out and I did go out and try to make films. And sometimes I was at the right place at the right time. But that was really all, I think that was like one time, and then I mean, before I even did that, while I was in film school, I was also worked with the late Chief Leonard George, who was one of Chief Dan George's sons. And he was very active in trying to create a film industry for Indigenous people. And he was coming at it in a similar way for, to exert our rights, exert our nation, tell our stories. And so he and I created a training program at what was then Capilano College. It might have been one of the first Native film programs, maybe not, because I think in the East it probably was more, and up north, obviously with Inuit Northern Broadcasting, there would have been training. And Native Communication Societies, I'm sure there was doing training, but I guess it was one. Anyways, whatever. We started it, and people like Tracy Kimbono, who's one of the matriarchs of the IM4 Lab, the late Barb Cramner, who was a great filmmaker from Alert Bay. Many others went through that program, and those are the kinds of things. Again, it was to create community. It was to be part of this kind of this mobilizing of our creative people to help tell our stories, to decolonize, to exercise our sovereignty. So then in the meantime, there's the industry. So, you come into this thing and you have your own vision, your own reason why you're there, and the industry doesn't understand that, doesn't acknowledge it. I mean, many times I was told the only reason I'm making this film, or the only reason I'm involved in this thing, the only reason I'm there is because I'm Native. And somehow they made exceptions to me to being there. Even though I've been to film school, even though I've been making, even if it was just little low budget videos that Native organizations asked me to do, I've done the work.
Loretta is not the only Indigenous filmmaker to face these microaggressions and outright racist perceptions that hold us back. To counteract these uncomfortable work situations, Indigenous filmmakers began to create their own environments that were more conducive to not only making the types of films they wanted to make, but the treatment they deserve. In 1984, Maria Campbell, along with her brother and daughter, founded an Aboriginal media producers group. Many of you know Maria Campbell as the author of Half-Breed and as a cherished Métis elder. But with her family and the start of their company, they were able to produce CTV Canada's first weekly Aboriginal television series titled My Partners, My People.
They were trying to get the National Film Board to create an Indigenous studio, which became Studio I, kind of, if you like, a parallel to the Women's Studio at National Film Board at one point. And then, we were trying to create, there was a time when someone asked me at the BAMP Center if I wanted to do a residency. And I said, no, instead of the money you would spend to do a residency, why don't we bring a whole bunch of Native filmmakers together and talk about how we could create our own residencies at the BAMP Center. And from that became the Aboriginal Art Center with people like, again, Maria Campbell and Marjorie Bocage. And I'm sure Amethyst First Writer was part of that discussion. There was probably about, I don't know, 10, 20 people around the table, having these discussions about how we could create this environment. So a lot of our time spent back in the 90s was organizing, creating space, creating opportunities for one another, for others, asserting that sovereignty over our image, over our stories, over our, the screens. We sponsored at the BAMP Center, we brought a, motley group of storytellers to come and do PSAs about Indigenous rights. And Angie Campbell came, and Gary Farmer, and Joan Cardinal Schubert, who, by the way, was trying to move into media and was getting blocked by the intelligentsia, if you like, of the art world, that, oh, no, you can't do that. So, we invited her to come, and she made an amazing film. And so we were doing, that's kind of proactive stuff. We weren't just waiting for the industry to favor us and, create space for us. We were creating our own space and, spent a lot of time doing that. And of course, that also then affects our ability to tell our own stories. But part of that was also in response to the fact that we weren't terribly welcome. We were kind of expected to be certain ways. And if we weren't those ways, then we were seen as radical or difficult. Or, I stood up for issues of appropriation. I belonged to, for a while, there was, I think it's still around, all these co-ops and collectives that were across Canada for media and video and filmmaking. And they would have they had a large AGM. And I remember asking them, because I was on the board of, I think, not Video in Cineworks was one of the co-ops in Vancouver. And I remember being there, and I was asking for this resolution to be passed about appropriation. And it wasn't like, oh, no, you can't tell Native stories, although that was at the base of it. But it was like, oh, if you're going to tell Native stories, you have to do it collaboration. You have to have permission. You have to have people engaged, not in meaningful ways. You have to collaborate. You have to have observed protocols long before they were talking about protocols and what came out. It was like we were doing this. We were encouraging it and trying to make it happen. And I remember at that meeting where we were passing this resolution, there was like many filmmakers, progressive, leftist, radical, so-called filmmakers who voted against it. And in fact, there were some whole provinces whose province starts with the letter Q, who walked out, wouldn't even vote, just abstained. This wouldn't have nothing to do with that. I think actually maybe they both voted against it. I think it was the Winnipeg Filmmakers Group and maybe some people from Saskatchewan that abstained, but Quebec wouldn't even concern themselves. And that was awakening for me, because I always thought we were kind of comrades in this, journey towards self-determination, sovereignty, and language rights. And to see that, it was very disheartening to me. But anyways, that's the kind of things we were doing. We were trying to create space. We were trying to create change. We were trying to, assert our sovereignty over the screens and still try to make films. And so those were journeys in themselves, because every film I made always had some kind of obstacle. And I, maybe part of it was me, maybe part of it was the institutionalized, racism, the systemic issues. But then in the process, I made this, I thought, very beautiful film. And then they said, oh, no, you can't. That film can't be a film. It can be 4 shorts. In other words, we're not going to give you the authority of being able to say you made a full 1-hour doc film. You're going to have to make these into little shorts. And which was contrary to the message of the film. The film was, I took what was then conceived traditional artists with with contemporary artists, so Joan Carter Schubert, Jane Ash Portra, with Doreen Jensen and Rena Point Bolton, and sort of wove their stories together to show that that traditional is within the contemporary and the contemporary is within the traditional, and that it's a continuum. And if it wasn't for the intervention of my very dear producer, Margaret Pettigrew, who retired, she stood up for me, and she kind of said, "Oh, Loretta, what we'll do is we'll give them one thing, and then they'll be happy." And so they had this whole list of things that they wanted done. And she says, "Why don't we say we do this one?" And I said, "Okay, we'll do this one." So then we did that one, and then they were like, "Oh yeah, okay, yeah." She followed our orders, and all was good. Eventually, that film got made. Same happened with Forgotten Warriors. I say that film took as long to make as it did longer to do that film than it did to fight the war. Not that I'm a soldier or a warrior in any way, like those men and women who were fought in the Second World War. But it was a battle. It was a battle. So it wasn't like we were being embraced by the industry. Everything was fraught with its struggles and with its hassles. And I'm sure every independent filmmaker in Canada will say the same, whether they're white or black or Asian. They'll say the same thing, particularly in that era. But I think it was one added layer for us is that there was still this idea that they controlled us, that as Indigenous people, we were still their subjects, or we were still their, what's the word, wards, that we were still we were still like children, and we had to follow their lead and be grateful for any, little bit of crumb that was provided. So there was that extra thing that we had to do battle with all the time, even if there were good people, and there were good people. There were certainly good people. I couldn't have made Hands of History without Margaret Pettigrew. I couldn't have made Forgotten Warriors without Jerry Kravich. I couldn't have made the People Go On without Bonnie Thompson. The people I made the Learning Path with were not film board people. It was Peter Raymond and James Cunningham. I couldn't have done it without their support. But the institutions that were around it were certainly there, and that attitude toward, well, me, and I would imagine others, the few of us that were there, that same kind of attitude that was somehow there at their largesse, rather than there because of our own determination, because of our own obligations and responsibilities back to our people and to our nations and to Indigenous rights and sovereignty. I know now some people would say, well, that's not really a filmmaker. Then you're really just a social activist, a political activist, a social justice warrior, or whatever. But, you can't, I could never separate the two. Sometimes I look back now and I go, maybe if I had been more selfish, if I had been more career oriented, if I had been more, played along with the industry, maybe I wouldn't be still struggling today to get stories told. But I had to stay true to my conscience and who I was.
I want to take a moment to practice my speech for the many awards that I get in the future, which I assume will be many because I'm talented. But in my speech will be Loretta Todd's name, because all the talent in the world will have gotten me nowhere if Loretta and many other Indigenous filmmakers had not chosen the path of selflessness. It is because they chose that path that Indigenous women like myself are able to even bring you this podcast today. As Loretta mentioned, the path for Indigenous storytellers has not gotten easier, even for a badass matriarch like herself. That is why it is important for us to learn our history and the struggles of those who came before us. We need to learn from the strategies of the warriors that fought in battles for us so we can continue to fight.
So then the 2000s come, and that kind of political, cultural, artistic kind of mobilization, if you like, organization became more difficult to do. I thought, well, gee, I really need to make a living. I need to be able to pay my bills and so on. And I went out looking for work. Here I made all these award-winning films. And I went looking for work with producers that I'd known, who were doing reality TV. And I couldn't even get a job doing reality TV. And at the same time, I remember I was at some meeting or party, I don't know what it was, it was something to do with the industry. And this woman came up to me and she says, you should option Monkey Beach. And I said, well, why should I option Monkey Beach? And they said, because her writing is like your filmmaking. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I went out and bought Monkey Beach, and I went, oh yeah, that it is. It is. It's very elliptical. Very. I don't know what Trickster's like. I think Trickster's maybe more graphic, but Monkey Beach was very elliptical, very. I want to say lyrical, impressionistic. So yeah, so that's kind of in the back. Have to go off and option that. Find a way to option that because that costs money, and you have to have lawyers and so on. And I was fortunate at the time to get an opportunity through, actually, this was a surprise to me. The film board called me up and said, hey, we'd maybe like you to consider directing this film, but we'll start with a research project to see whether there's a film there. And it was working with the Kainai people because they were doing an exhibit. They were returning some of the things that had been gathered from the people, and they were putting it in an exhibit in Lethbridge. And there was sort of like the sense that they were coming home. So they wanted me, to look into making this film. So yeah, so I had work. But anyways, I don't want to just sort of focus on myself so much. I mean, I will kind of relate that back to my work in a minute. But in the meantime, so what was going on in the industry? Well, there was some things that were good. There was something that is forgotten now, and I think it really was one of the major agents for change in the mediascape of Canada that is often forgotten. And it was what was called CHUM.
Quick sidebar here again. I need to explain CHUM's pretty cool origin story. Well, not CHUM itself, because it was started by a group of wealthy people. For those who don't know about CHUM, it continues to be one of Canada's largest radio and television holding companies, including CTV and Much Music. For my Toronto natives, remember that car sticking out of that building on John Street? That's CHUM. Anyway, the cool story behind CHUM is actually with Moses Zainmer, a guy they hired who would become an innovative pioneer in the Canadian broadcasting industry, who was a champion for diversity. So Moses was born to Jewish parents who met while fleeing the Holocaust. When I Googled him, it said his exact birth date is unknown and listed as on a train during wartime. So next time people shit on Canadian content, you could tell them that story and how our content can sometimes be a little dry, but the stories of some of our executives are pretty badass.
So across Canada, there was, like in Toronto especially, there was the City TV channels. And City TV in Toronto had Duke Redbird. I mean, Duke Redbird, who was like this poet, radical poet, because he had been back in the movement. I don't know if he was part of Ames, but he was certainly part of the kind of radical movement of the 60s and 70s and 80s. And now he's doing, stand-ups on City TV in Toronto about, some Indigenous event that was happening in Toronto that weekend. So, it was like really, it was cool. So the guy had work, he could make a living, and his voice and his image, this native guy with white hair was on TV. Like, who does that? So there was a kind of something kind of happening around that. And so I say that because I think that there was this hardening, and in that, City TV, CHUM, and CTV, Bell, were fighting to start a new channel in Vancouver. And originally, City TV wanted to sort of have, like it had in Toronto, this building that was City TV, that was like a cornerstone, if you like literally, physically, and mentally, of Canadian media leadership. So that was where Much Music came out of. That's where you had things where, people would have discussions about all kinds of issues that just weren't going on in the media from the people who were affected by the things that they were discussing, not just some academics, you know, in their lofty, spaces talking about these things, but people literally who were part of these movements, Black artists, South Asian artists, all the people who make up Toronto. This was being, discussed at City TV, like openly on the corner. You could come and take a look, watch it, and it would show up on Much Music. So they were fighting to open a channel similar to that in Vancouver with CTV, who wanted to also have that space and be this sort of, big player in Vancouver. Well, City TV didn't get it. They actually got a smaller opportunity in Victoria, which I think is all gone because Chum's all gone. Chum got bought up by Rogers, I think, eventually. But in there, so when CTV got that space and got that channel, Jeff Bear, who had been one of those leaders in Indigenous media, even before me, he proposed a show called First Story, which would be like a half-hour sort of news magazine series about Indigenous people. So in those days, when they went to the CRTC to get these new channels, they had to have benefits back to the community. They had to put that in their channel proposals to the CRTC. And in those days, they thought, oh, well, we got to make it look good, so we're going to put Native stuff in there. So it wasn't because necessarily the people really cared about Native storytelling, but because they wanted to because we were in the Broadcast Act, there was also, a commitment within the Broadcast Act. There was an idea that broadcasters had to, serve our needs to tell our stories. It wasn't like the law, but it was like sort of like that was an expectation. So when there was all these channels trying to build up in those days. It was a kind of people buying each other out. There was like a crazy time. Those were those benefits that kind of came back. And so Jeff Bear starts First Story. I did a couple episodes, but he also hired some other Native independent producers, broadcasters, sort of starting off, people who, were trying to get their opportunities to tell stories. So there's those little things going on that were kind of making a difference as far as our presence, on the screens, on TVs and so on. And that was the other thing that was kind of happening at the time. But it still wasn't enough for me to make a living. And at the same time, APTN was coming in. So Rosemary Kaptana, George Henry, and Isaiah, another Inuit fellow who was part of the movement to get APTN approved, who came from Inuit broadcasting and Northern Native broadcasting and came together to create APTN. And that was also happening at the same time in the early aughts. And so there was another opportunity for us that we've never had before. So you can't really say the industry did anything for us. It was always us doing for ourselves. And then because of some political, expectation that Native stories be heard, which again was, through the lobbying and efforts of people. And I'm pretty sure Jeff Bear had something to do with this broadcast. The Aboriginal broadcasting there had to be some sort of representation of Aboriginal people within this broadcasting, so that the CRTC had to have that expectation for these new channels to include this. Anyways, this was a kind of the other atmosphere that was going on at the time, which then was kind of opening doors for us for ourselves, so that we didn't have to go to the industry with our hats in hand and say, oh, we need this, we need that, please, sir. So that was kind of like a really, I think, awakening, which eventually led to me being able to create Nahi Waitin, which was my first children's series I did. And then eventually Kawi Science. I had an effort at drama. I created a series called Sky and Chang, which still breaks my heart. Didn't happen, but it was a martial arts sci-fi mashup. It had Sarah Lise MacArthur and Olivia Chang, and it was going to be this great, I thought, really innovative series, which I still think it is. But it didn't get, APTN said it would be too expensive to create because it had martial arts and special effects. As far as the bigger industry, well, we're not truly decolonized in Canada. We're not truly in control of our sovereignty through our screens yet. I mean, when we're still subject to their largesse, and as far as their largesse goes, they pick and choose. So all I can do is counter it, and how I counter that is by living by example and modeling the way I would imagine my grandmothers would want me to be. And that is just to continue to create environment and spaces and opportunities for our community so we can keep growing, so that we get to the point where there's like a critical mass, that there's so many of us that they can't deny us anymore. And so that's kind of been my strategy for a while.
That concludes today's history lesson on the battle of Indigenous filmmakers versus the Canadian screen industry. We hope you were taking notes, because if you'd ever like to receive funding from the ISO, there is a quiz now. Kidding, obviously. But the fact that we even have an Indigenous screen office is amazing, because during my travels across the film festival circuit, it's clear not every Indigenous person across the globe receives these supports. But stay tuned for the next episode, because I did have more I wanted to ask Loretta about here at home. Like, even though we do have these supports in place, and it seems like everyone wants to hear our stories, are we actually telling them the way we want to tell them? Or are we having our stories suppressed and watered down by colonial gatekeepers? Will anyone want to watch my creepy Métis Children of the Corn parody? Was my half-breed, inbred lineage all for nothing? I ask Loretta this and more on our next episode. This episode was written and hosted by Samantha Loney, with music composed by Etienne Beausoleil, edited by Cassidy Villebron-Baracus, and produced by the Métis and Me program. This podcast was made in support from our sponsors, 880 Cities and the City of Barrie's Arts and Culture Investment Program. Remember to like and subscribe for more content. Merci for listening.